I just don't know what to think about that guy.
Pollsters are weird, man.
Yes. Yeah, there we go. We'll just say that. Hey everyone, and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. I'm here in the Upper Room Studios with Scott Melson. Hello, Scott.
What's up, man?
You have a friend with you today.
I do.
Who's with us?
Mithin.
Mithin. Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us.
Mithin Mansinghani?
That's pretty darn good.
Yeah, how do you actually say it?
That's perfect. I'm not going to correct that.
Hot damn.
We'll take it.
Look at that.
Mithin is the Solicitor General for the state of Oklahoma. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I pronounced that correctly.
You guys didn't know we had one of those, did you?
That's exactly right.
Right now, you're all picturing some old guy in long black robes and a white wig with a British accent.
And Mithin is none of those,
I wish.
except for the wig, which is a little awkward with his Bermuda shorts.
Why did he bring that, do you think? The long white wig.
I think it's an air of prestige.
The curls lend it gravitas.
I left my powder at home.
Oh, that's true.
It's a little awkward.
We're obviously just kidding. But he is wearing a suit, which is more than Scott and I can say.
Yeah.
I brought a sport coat today and left it in the car the entire day.
Unlike usual, I'm not potting naked.
It's true. Praise be.
Just so we're all clear, I've never potted naked.
No, just our souls. So we are going to visit with Mithin here in just a minute. But first, not really any announcements right now. At the time this episode airs, it'll be after the primary runoff, after our debates, and we are full steam ahead towards the general election, barring any bizarre news that comes out in the next week.
I'm so excited. I love election season.
So Scott and I are both on vacation at the time you're listening to this, which is why we're recording today.
I'm still voting, though.
And that's all right. Are you voting early?
I'm voting tomorrow.
I'm going to go on, I think, on Saturday morning.
Are you positive that you can? Because it's a runoff, and they only offer early voting on Saturdays and Sundays in statewide and federal elections. I know that this is technically a statewide election because it's a statewide runoff, but you might want to verify.
That's an excellent
That's all I'm
question.
saying.
They announced early voting today, so I'm assuming so.
Okay. I will be at the election board at some point tomorrow to cast my ballot.
All right. Good for you. Oh, yeah, I think we're planning to go on Saturday. It is my wife's birthday. And what better way to celebrate than early voting?
Dude,
Am I right?
Should I wear my I voted t-shirt?
I was about to say, you should wear your I voted t-shirt.
Do you want an I voted t-shirt?
That sounds pretty amazing. Do you sell them in extra smalls?
You know what? You came
They're
on the
small.
pod. I bet we can make it happen.
We can make this happen.
Yeah.
So if you, listeners, would like a fashionable navy blue, very soft t-shirt with a I voted sticker screen printed on the left chest where everyone wears your sticker,
Why? Why is it screen printed?
because that's how the shirt is made.
Because it's not a sticker. It's a way of life.
Oh, okay. This is true. It is a way of life.
I'm always voting.
Hello, I voted every day. And a little quote from Margaret Mead on the back that we have on our website. What is it? Never underestimate the power of a group of people.
Small group of people to
Damn
change
it.
the world.
Yeah.
Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
That's exactly right. That's on the back of the shirt.
I get a lot of compliments on that shirt.
It's a good shirt.
Well done.
You can buy them. You can purchase them online on letsfixthisok.org/store. Also, we now have a little Let's Fix This soft enamel lapel pins. It's a soft enamel pin. You can put it on your lapel, your hat, your backpack, your purse strap, your dog leash, your thing in your car, sun
The
visor.
sun visor. Do people put lapel pins
I
on
don't.
their
You
sun
put whatever you
visors?
want. Listen, if you want to show off your Let's Fix This flair, I don't care where you put it.
You put a flare on your sun visor, don't you?
I do not. I have a new car. It's new to me. I put a sticker on the back, which you can also buy in the online store. 4-inch. It is UV protected. Great bumper sticker material. Thick government plastic. Let's Fix This round sticker.
What kind of car did you get?
We talked about this in the last episode. I got a Subaru Outback. It looks just like yours. Damn it. I know. It's the same color. Same color.
I'm so proud.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoy it. All right, so we have those things for sale, and let's start with our weekly question, which we skipped last week. But we do have a weekly question. That's our sound effect we're trying out tonight for the weekly question.
You can vote on Twitter.
Yeah, just tweet at us. Good sound effect, bad sound effect. Good use of sound effect or bad use of sound effect?
There we go.
I'm
All right,
sad
so-
that you disenfranchise non-Twitter users like myself.
Also on Facebook.
Wow.
Ooh, there's a new
He's
platform
calling
called.
me out. We're like 5 minutes in.
We'll
He's
call
already,
him out for not being
he's
on
already
Twitter.
throwing shade.
Even the president is on Twitter, which is a good reason to not be on, I suppose. But
Particularly when you read his tweets.
they are bizarre. His one about Michael Cohen today was pretty funny. Where it's like, if you need a good attorney, don't call this guy.
Did you see the other thing he said this morning?
No, that's all I saw.
Yeah. He said campaign finance violations are not a crime.
Okay,
But
I don't.
But they are, though. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that, I mean, if you get indicted and then plead guilty to campaign finance violations, it would seem to suggest that it's a crime.
Or at least unsavory.
No.
I don't know.
Crime.
I'm not a lawyer.
I don't think-
I'm not going to put Mithin on the spot here.
Being non-specific, can you plead guilty to something that's not a crime? Is that a thing that can happen?
No.
See? Okay. So you can't plead guilty to something that's not a crime.
I don't have enough knowledge to argue this. You're the one who should teach the LSAT courses.
Yes, you technically can, but you'd have a good chance on appeal.
Oh, shit.
Well, because it's not a thing, right? You could just be like I could plead guilty for loving cheese too much, but it's not a crime.
It just seems like if you go to court, they're like, how do you plead? And like, guilty. But like, you're pleading for something.
But if it's not a crime, you wouldn't be in court, man.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. Campaign finance violations are crimes.
Okay. Let's go back to our weekly question. I'm going to play the sound effect again. That's right. It's time for our weekly question. Our question today is, I need a drum roll. That's the sound effect I need. Anyway, if a candidate aligns themselves with another notable current political figure, does that positively affect your opinion as a voter of that candidate? So in many cases, it's the president. Like right now, some candidates are aligning themselves with President Trump. Candidates formerly align themselves with President Obama. Obviously, different candidates. But if a candidate that you are paying attention to of either party aligns himself with someone else, does that help your opinion of the candidate? Please respond on Twitter. You can tweet at us at Let's Fix This OK. We would love to hear from you. You can also email if you have a longer response. Podcast at letsfixthisok.org.
You want to know something funny?
Please.
You were like, obviously different candidates.
Not necessarily, I guess.
Senator Heidi Heitkamp, North Dakota, aligned herself with President Obama, and in this election cycle, currently emphasizing the fact that she votes with President Trump over 50% of the time.
That seems over 50% is not that much considering there's people who vote with him like 99.9% of the time.
Right, but it's still a majority.
That's all I got. I
Was
don't
that
know.
a joke?
No, I don't know. It's the applauses.
That was a bad joke. It was a joke. Somebody, we're going to take that thing away from you.
Just showing off my new sound effects that I downloaded a minute ago. All right.
Shall we get into it?
We should. So we've got three articles in our news roundup today that we're going to run through. Well, 2 articles and then 2 other
Tidbits.
written tidbits. And Mithin is wondering, why did I get myself into here? So the first thing is really a recommendation for you guys and all of our listeners. There's a book that came out this week called Boomtown by Sam Anderson. Mithin, have you seen this?
Yes.
All right, so I got an advanced copy in the mail the other day. I don't know how. It just came. I was very excited, so I started reading it.
Hashtag Big Daddy.
Or something. I think probably a friend of a friend of a friend had extra books in their garage, and they're just need to get rid of them. Anyway, it's actually a fantastic book. So it's about Oklahoma City. Sam Anderson writes for the Times, I think. Came to Oklahoma with the assignment to write about the Thunder, specifically James Harden when he was here in that kind of transition.
Hashtag the beard.
The beard back in 2012-ish. And when Mr. Anderson got here, he says he realized there was something different about Oklahoma City, something curious. And he said, I'm going to need to spend more time here and get into it. So the book, the way it's written, he's an excellent writer. It starts at the beginning, right? So, well, he really does go into Pangea, if you can believe that, like the beginning, way back. But then skips ahead a few millennia to the land run. But each chapter is only a few pages long, and he's kind of telling concurrent stories of how Oklahoma City was founded, how the Thunder got here, and then the Thunder's development, Westbrook, Hardin, Durant, how all this stuff came to be, and the
Does he
phrase,
talk about Durant's ultimate betrayal?
not yet. I'm only on like page 104, but I think it may be coming. But the way that he phrases things, he like draws parallels between the Land Run and the Thunder's roster, and how, Presti's process is like held above all else, and how that is similar to the stuff in the beginning. Anyway, it is ensnaring. It is very interesting. It's funny. It's weird. It makes you reflect on Oklahoma as a state and Oklahoma City in particular. The book opens with a story about a gunfight, and I do love a Western. And the gunfight is a little graphic and horrific because there was a lot of blood involved and someone biting someone's ear. Anyway, I recommend it. Boomtown. Check it out. I'm sure it's on Amazon, and you can probably get it Full Circle.
I've heard great things about it.
You can borrow it when I'm done if you'd like.
That's on my list of things to read. I bet you can get it Full Circle. I bet you can get it at Commonplace too.
I'm sure you can. We should hit up Ben Knuckles at Commonplace.
Thanks, Ben.
Good place. All right. So the second thing we want to highlight is that 538 Politics, which is an excellent website, whom we mention almost weekly.
We kind of idolize them a little bit.
We both listen to their podcast for one, so that's
Yes.
part of our weekly consumption of news. 538, all spelled out, not the numbers, 538.com. They released their much anticipated House forecast this week. So this is for the election. They forecast what the election is going to look like for the House of Representatives, for the U.S. House. And again, we don't normally talk about national level stuff because we listen to 538, and you and I talk about it off the air.
Yes, constantly.
Constantly. And so, in fact, you texted me like the moment this was posted.
It's like,
It's out. It's ready.
It's out.
So they've got three hamburger rated levels: light, classic, and deluxe, which Nate Silver says adds bacon. And it's a really data driven way to look at polls and how to see what's going to happen. And they constantly update it with new polls that are coming out. If you're interested in polling, in numbers and stats, and some good political insight, they do have a great podcast.
Chances are, if you listen to this podcast, you will dig their house model. You should. If you listen to Andy and I rant every week, you should check out 538 because you will enjoy it.
Yeah, and if you take any issue with their model, tweet at them.
Yes, and they do also solicit feedback. However, before you take issue with the model, I would say come prepared because they've got like doctoral statisticians that work on this deal. So
It is a smart deal.
if you're gonna come at them, bring your stuff.
Yeah, so they have a forecast for every district, which is really interesting, including districts here in Oklahoma. You can kind of hover over it. It's pretty interesting. This year they're doing like the chance of winning rather than just a percentage. They're also saying like a greater than 99 out of 100 chance that he'll, like Mark Wayne Mullen is who I'm looking at here in Oklahoma's 2nd district. We live in the Oklahoma 5th district. So right now Steve Russell has a 7 in 9 chance. Kendra Horn a 2 in 9 chance. According to this, Scott, you pointed out that the 2 in 9 chance is similar to what Trump had at this stage.
Yeah.
For winning the presidency.
Yeah. So if you look at the prediction for the Oklahoma 5th, the odds of Kendra Horn winning are roughly the same as the odds were of Donald Trump winning the presidency. So
yeah,
that's just food for thought.
It is interesting, and there's a long way to go till the election. So there's that. Check out 538.com. Second article, first actual article, we have one from Oklahoma Watch called Stitt's Mortgage Firm Failed to Tell Regulators of Past Problems. If you've watched TV in the last couple of weeks, or listened to our podcast last week with Daniela, we discussed some of the ads that have been coming out about Kevin Stitt. So he's the guy from Tulsa. He's running for governor, running for the Republican nomination right now against Mick Cornett. And this news really came out early on in the election from Gary Richardson, the attorney from Tulsa that I think he paid for the research on this initially. So Stitt owns Gateway Mortgage, and of all the industries that have faced some turmoil in the last decade, mortgage industry is one. And so they had some pretty big fines back in 2009, 2011, the state of Wisconsin. stopped, pulled their license, and they had to reapply for it. There's some kind of stuff back then, and so it's just interesting. I think it's if you're someone who likes to really look into everything about a candidate and their businesses with whom they associate.
Well, and if you've been paying attention to the ads, right? So we talked last week about the Bullstead ad that Mick Cornett has been running, and if you're trying to kind of get beyond, all right, well, Mick Cornett's running this ad, but is there really anything to it? This is an article that kind of lets you explore, okay, what's the substance behind the attack ad, right? Like how,
is that true?
Yeah, and so this is kind of a reference to say, here's what's happened, here's what hasn't happened, and then you can look at that, you can look at the ad and make up your own mind. Is this something that makes sense or that doesn't?
Right.
One thing that I was thinking about this. So the Bullstead slogan, and I have no idea how this works. Let's say that Kevin Stitt wins the runoff, right? And so then he faces Drew Edmondson in the general election. Can Drew Edmondson use the Bullstead?
If it's not trademarked, but obviously it didn't work if Stitt wins.
Oh, I wouldn't say that it didn't work.
So I would say the fact, or maybe the fact that if Kevin Stitt wins, that doesn't mean that the Bullstead is not an effective line of attack. It means it's not an effective attack in a Republican primary, right? Where you're talking to a very different voter, particularly in a Republican primary runoff, than you are for a general election. And I just didn't know, I don't know if those things are once you put something like that in a political ad, is it trademarked or copyrighted in any way that another campaign couldn't just not
use
unless
it?
They file for it, yeah.
And that's interesting because one of the things that has come up in Republican circles in the last couple of weeks, there are people that are concerned about how nasty this primary has gotten, and they're worried that nastiness is going to carry over into the general election. Now that's an argument that we hear in elections all the time. People said it about the Democratic primary in 2008. They said it about the Republican primary in 2016, and those predictions were wildly off. So the fact that the primary has gotten nasty does not mean that the general election is going to go one way or the other. But I just thought it was an interesting question. Could Edmondson pick up the exact same line of attack and even use the same slogan in his own ads?
Right. It's interesting. It's possible. This past week, I think, on the News OK, the Political State podcast that the folks at the Oklahoman do, Ben Felder and Dale and Justin.
What's up, guys? If you're listening.
Chris is the other one. They discussed it, and they said, folks in the metro, particularly younger folks, really enjoyed that ad. But when you got out into kind of the rural areas, that ad does not resonate as well. And so they were concerned it might backfire in Cornett.
Interesting.
The ad was really released kind of in response to some polling that showed Cornett behind 9 or 11 points. And so that's, if you put this out as a way to try to close the gap, it might work in urban areas, but might not so well in rural areas.
Why would it backfire in rural areas specifically?
Because it's pretty close to saying shit, man. Some people just don't appreciate that kind of sentiment, that kind of language being used.
So from a moral standpoint,
yeah.
This is unbecoming.
Yeah, and
interesting.
And I think a lot of people, if you're watching Wheel of Fortune at night after dinner, right, and right before bed, and depending on your habits,
the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plane.
Yes, that it could be a bit of a jarring thing. I haven't asked my grandma about it, but I'm sure she's kind of I don't love it, just based on the fact that it's a little bit crude. Or
I will just let you know that my grandpa would have loved it. My grandpa would have been like, "My dad just say bullshit." That's what my grandpa would have said.
Just go for the gold.
Yeah, but all right,
fair enough. And then our last article is from the Frontier, independent journalism outfit in Tulsa. Really great. They do all kinds of great work. An article from Clifton Adcock titled "Many Oklahoma Congressional Candidates Worth Millions, Financial Disclosures Show." So again, this is on the national level, but if you are interested, we all know that Congress is way disproportionately filled with millionaires compared to the general public.
Because a lot of people would argue that in order to successfully run, you need to be a millionaire.
Yeah. So this looks at all the candidates who filed a disclosure. Not everyone did. And incumbents are required to. I don't think all the candidates are required to,
Candidates are not required to.
but many do anyway. So it's really interesting to kind of see where folks stack up. I mean, some people have, a net worth, and they kind of estimate, and the Frontier goes into how they estimated it. So, some folks net worth estimated between, negative 50,000 and positive 185,000. So that's kind of the range at which it might range when you factor in mortgages and that student loan debt, that kind of thing.
Goddamn student loans.
Yeah, that's the truth. Man, I tell you what about student loans, though, while we're on the subject. I tried to consolidate mine this past week, but because my most recent loans from my MBA that I just finished it's still in school status. So I did all this work and applied, and they sent the letter, and they're like, "Oh, well, you can't. Here we can consolidate all your old ones, it's like one big consolidation and then two tiny ones, but not these because they're still in school status." And I was like, "Well, I'm out of school. How do I change that?" And the lady basically said, "You got to wait 6 months." I was like, "But interest, like."
They're worried you might go back.
No, yeah, I guess they probably have to get some notification. I just thought it was really inefficient. So, anywho, if you are curious about congressional members or candidates and their net worth, check out The Frontier. As always, we will post these links on our blog page when this episode posts.
Delightful.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk to our guest, Mithin, who's sitting by patiently.
Indeed.
Be right back. Hey, we're back. Mithin, I like that you danced during that. That made me very happy.
We like enthusiasm on
We
here.
do.
Here on
Most
the pod.
people don't like my dancing, so that's unusual.
Why? Why don't people like your dancing? You seem like you've got rhythm. You're a fun guy.
He's got rhythm. He's got... I don't know.
It's Ive.
I know, but I'm thinking about him. I don't have rhythm.
Evidence to the contrary, right here.
I snapped 3 times. And
No, so we are very pleased to have a guest this week, Mithin Monsingani, who is the Solicitor General of Oklahoma. Hi, Mithin. How are you?
Doing well, Scott. How are you?
I'm good. I appreciate you being here. Mithin and I serve and work together on another board here in Oklahoma City. And we were talking a couple weeks ago at a function, and I was like, dude, you have a cool job. You should come on this podcast we do and talk about it. And he was like, yeah, all right, I can do that. So here we are. Mithin, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from and kind of your background, and how did you become Mithin Monsingani, Esquire, Solicitor General of Oklahoma?
Certainly. So I was born and raised in Deep South Texas on the border with Mexico. Went to college at Rice University down in Houston.
is it the Owls?
The Owls, Rice
Go
Owls.
Owls.
Yeah, go Owls.
It's the Ivy League of Texas.
Ivy grows better in the South.
It does.
As we said. And then I went to the place where ivy doesn't grow as well. I went to Harvard for law school. And after that, clerked on a federal court of appeals, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which for my judge, whose chambers are in Houston, the court's based out of New Orleans. And then went to go work for a large law firm in D.C., which, if any of your listeners are lawyers, kind of knows what the big law experience is like. Decided after a few years there that I wanted to enter into public service. Started thinking about where I wanted to do that, and Oklahoma kind of fit with what I was looking for best, and came down here to serve as Deputy Solicitor General. And I did that for a couple years, and a year and a half ago, Attorney General Mike Hunter appointed me to be the state's second Solicitor General.
So you're technically are you a political appointee then? Is that?
I'm appointed by an elected official.
Okay.
I'm a state employee, just like
Okay.
any other assistant attorney general or any other at-will state employee.
So I bring that up because I feel like there's a lot of things that are like get talked about in the media, and there's like these buzzwords that people automatically are like, oh, that must be terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is like lobbyist. One of them is career politician. Another one would be political appointee. And it's just like, look, we got one sitting right here. He's a nice guy, dedicated public servant, is appointed.
And that was a much more personal appointment than for a while I was a member of the Oklahoma Suicide Prevention Council, and was awaiting an appointment from the governor, which you just kind of apply online. And the way that council's set up is that certain positions are appointed by the governor, by the speaker, by the pro tem. But it's not like she and I ever visited about it.
Right.
You just kind of apply, and eventually they're supposed to send it back. I think there's a huge backlog of those kind of appointments that are floating around out there.
Probably. Wouldn't it be cool if the governor could just be like, I appoint all the people that are on the waiting list?
I would like to get knighted. Like if we came into the blue room and she was like, I appoint you to the Suicide Prevention Council.
That would be badass.
That's not the
I did
governor's.
get a commission. There was
Ooh.
it's a certificate that says the Attorney General officially appoints me as
Right.
Solicitor General for the state of Oklahoma.
Nice. You take
It's
the-
not,
the
it's not
picture
like a
where you-
statutory position.
Right.
He just went up to you big time.
Well, I'm in no way trying to diminish his appointment. Mine never came through, and I just got busy with other things. But congratulations to you. Please go ahead.
So I have several questions because I think you actually have it's a really I think that's a really cool kind of origin story because it's one that gets, I feel like that's an origin story that you hear like in media sometimes. You hear about it on, like TV shows if you're obsessed with the West Wing. So I'm just curious, like, so you went to undergrad, you went to law school at Harvard, which is just a tip of the hat to you, sir. But then you were clerking for you said a U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals judge. Is that right?
That's correct.
So what is that experience like? And why as a young lawyer fresh out of school, is that something that you would want to do?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So, when people throw around the word clerk, they think of like the guy who's at the gas station behind the counter. They
Right.
don't really know what it means. And so, for example, right now we're in the middle of a U.S. Supreme Court nomination process with Judge Brett Kavanaugh, and people will say, "Oh, this person clerked for Judge Brett Kavanaugh," or Judge Kavanaugh clerked for so and so. But a law clerk for a judge or a federal judge, especially on either the district court, the appeals court, the Supreme Court, is one of a set of people. So in the appeals realm, there's 4 law clerks that act as the judge's right-hand men and women. So they research the law for the judges, they help draft opinions, and they act as sort of vice or deputy judges in the sense that they are helping the judge do his job in the very substantive sense, not in necessarily a clerical sense, despite the fact that they're called a clerk,
Right.
but in a very real sense. So we help the judge decide cases by informing him about research, by informing him about the facts of the case and things like that.
Because there's a ton, like when you're excuse me, when you're talking about court cases, particularly at like the level of the Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the last stop right before the U.S. Supreme Court, you're talking about cases that have been litigated already at several prior levels, right? And one or both of the parties is wanting it to continue move up to the chain because they've been unhappy with a previous outcome, right?
That's right.
And so these are cases typically that are pretty complicated. They have maybe a lot of like constitutional issues at the core of them that maybe one of the parties feels like is either not clear or what seems to be clear should be kind of defined in a different way. And so I think there's a tendency to hold up judges, and I think Supreme Court justices are the best example of this, as like these, brilliant minds and scholars. And I think that's true, but I also think that many brilliant minds and scholars have a lot of other really, really smart people that are helping them do the background research and debate the issues and discuss the issues and bring all of the facts together to help that person with, this brilliant legal mind kind of formulate what they think. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I sometimes joke that the government is actually run by 20 and 30 somethings, right? Because the judges and justices obviously play important roles, but the law clerks are helping to write their opinions, right? Congress members and state representatives play important roles in voting, but who's actually writing the legislation, right? It's their 20 or 30 something staffers. So yeah, law clerks play an important role, and it's a very important relationship too between the judge and the law clerk, because the judge acts as not just a boss but a mentor.
Right. Well, and I think when we look at Supreme Court nominations or anything, who someone clerked under is always very important. And I think understanding why that's important to be like, oh, this person was kind of their mentor. And so if you like them, you might like this person. I think that's really helpful.
And this is oftentimes a job that's straight out of law school, right? So this is one of the first people to form you in a professional sense, not just an educational sense, as how you think as a lawyer.
Which is interesting to me. Why is it that clerkships like this are something that tends to happen straight out of law school as opposed to something that happens after you've been in practice for, a few years to kind of develop, a thought process or a strategy that is unique to you?
That's a good question. It's possible that some of it has to do with money. So if you're a really brilliant person and you've been a lawyer for 10 years, taking a huge pay cut to become a federal law clerk, maybe not something you're willing to do. So if the judge just wants really smart people, the best time to get them is straight out of law school. Although, at the U.S. Supreme Court level, there are plenty of people who are several years out of law school that are clerking, especially I think Justice Thomas and even Justice Alito tends to hire people who've had quite a bit more experience. And the other answer might be something that's just kind of quirky in the legal profession. So in almost all other academic fields, you have peer-reviewed journals, right? The scholarship is published in journals that are reviewed, selected, edited by people who are the peers of the scholars, right? Other professors, other researchers, things like that. Not so with legal scholarship. Most legal scholarship, and often the highest quality legal scholarship, is published by student-reviewed journals. So,
like the Harvard Law Review,
right? I was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and I, as a relatively know-nothing, second and third year law student at 22, 23 years old, was judging scholarship about whether it should be published in the most cited legal journal in all of the country. So there may be a culture in law, for example, for some reason that tends to give young people a lot of interesting and meaningful opportunities.
Interesting.
That was not discussed in my business law class that I had when we discussed like common law and how the law of the land in the United States comes to be. No mention of like, well, a bunch of 25-year-olds are going to be just figuring stuff out.
That's super interesting to me. I have a couple more questions about that, and then we'll move on because I find this fascinating. But I don't know if all of our listeners do or not. Maybe they do. But so two things: these clerkships, again, particularly first of all, are there clerkships that occur below the level of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals? Like, does the Oklahoma State Supreme Court, do they have law clerks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to say the Oklahoma Supreme Court is below the Court of Appeals.
Okay,
they're two entirely different systems.
Fair enough. That is an excellent clarification.
And people don't realize that those are separate.
Right.
Yeah.
Separate tracks.
But so federal district court judges, which are the trial judges, have law clerks. The Oklahoma Supreme Court has law clerks. So there are people outside of the Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court that are law clerks.
What I have heard is that clerkships at the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals level and, of course, the Supreme Court are quite competitive.
Yes, very competitive. Yeah.
And it's a pretty prestigious thing to be chosen to like come out of law school and clerk for one of these justices. So I guess my final question is, why would somebody who went to Rice and then went to Harvard Law and then had a prestigious clerkship and then got a high-powered lawyer job in a big firm in D.C., which just kind of seems like that's like the career path for someone with that resume, decide, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to work in public service, and specifically, I want to do it in the great state of Oklahoma?
Yeah. I think it's probably a combination of two things. So one is the desire I've had for the entirety of my career to engage in public service at some point, and for me, it was more of a question of when than if. At the time that I was at the firm, I kind of felt it was the right when time, and then why Oklahoma? The opportunities that were available here in this state kind of appealed to me best, and the opportunity to become Solicitor General in a relatively short order of time was really great, and I'm glad I did it. I'm very thankful for Attorney General Mike Hunter of giving me this opportunity because not only do I get to engage in public service, but I also have the opportunity to have a lot more control over the cases I litigate, to be the lead lawyer on those cases rather than being seventh down on the totem pole as a, fifth, sixth year lawyer where the 30-year partner is arguing the case. One of the appeals of public service, regardless of where you're doing it in law, whether you're in a state attorney general's office or a prosecutor or a public defender, is being able to get a lot more on your feet responsibility, even managerial experience, a lot quicker than you ever would in the private sector.
Very cool. Very cool. Super interesting. Well, I feel like we've kind of already touched on like the next thing I want to get into, which is, we mentioned earlier that I think most people hear solicitor and they're like, if they think of anything, they think of like some old white British dude in a powdered wig and a long black robe.
Or just the no soliciting sign on someone's front door.
Or that's probably what most people think of. I had an obsession with Charles Dickens as a kid, so I think of David Copperfield and solicitors. But anyway.
Never read that.
That's because wow, dude.
It wasn't assigned. I don't know. I read something else.
Never just read things because they're awesome.
Yeah, Boomtown by Sam Anderson right now.
Go read David Copperfield.
I'll read that next.
What is a solicitor general? What is Oklahoma, the solicitor general of Oklahoma, what do you do?
Yeah. So I'm the chief advocate in court for the state in appeals and constitutional issues, especially cases that are in front of the Oklahoma Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. Other states have solicitors general, not all of them do. The United States has had a long-standing solicitor general. And right now it is Noel Francisco, but they vary from administration to administration.
Harriet Myers.
Harriet Myers was not a Solicitor General. She was White House counsel.
Oh, what?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Oh.
Ted Cruz was Solicitor General of
Was
Texas.
Elena Kagan a Solicitor General?
Elena Kagan was Obama's first Solicitor General.
That's who I was thinking of.
She was also my first year law school dean. She left during my first year of law school to become Solicitor General.
Oh, look at this, dude. He's just schooling me like left
I did
and right.
like how strongly you responded to that, and probably blew our mic up.
So the U.S. has long had a Solicitor General position, but in the States it's actually a relatively recent phenomenon. So I'd probably say over the last 15 or 20 years the states have adopted the Solicitor General role, and that's in part because the states have seen the need to increase the quality of advocacy before appellate courts, to have people who are appellate specialists rather than just have the same person who did the trial go on and do the appeal, especially in front of, the very important cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. And the other is to, when those really important cases come up, to have an advocate there so you don't have to go out and hire an advocate. So, the state in a lot of ways saves money by not having to hire as much outside counsel, by having somebody who is a specialist in appeals and constitutional issues and is following stuff that's going on at the Supreme Court on a daily basis.
So why do you need, in my non-legal mind, if you got a lawyer and they try a case in district court, let's say they win, and the other party appeals. Well, if that lawyer won the trial case, like in district court, why do you need an appellate specialist in the district court and the kind of going up the chain?
Yeah. They're a little bit of two different skills. So, I'm not a trial lawyer, and I really respect what trial lawyers do, and they have a different skill set than I do. With appeals, it's a little bit more intellectual. It's a little bit more ivory tower. And it's a little bit more focused on the law and how it should be shaped rather than the facts of the particular case and developing those facts. So the facts are very important, but when you're a trial lawyer, one of your main goals is to develop the facts by interviewing the right witnesses, by producing the right documents in order to win your case. By the time you go on appeal, fact development is over. You have the facts that have been set in the trial court. Appeals courts do not find new facts. They just deal with the facts as they come to them. So you're a lot more focused on how does the law apply to the facts, or for that matter, pure questions of law of what is the law, or what should the law be in a situation where there's no sort of clear precedential answer. And that exercise is a little bit different from what trial lawyers do, and appeals lawyers have the benefit of regularly knowing what appeals courts care about. So being able to filter out the issues that they think are most likely to prevail at the appeals court, whether if you are appealing or you're defending an appeal.
That is like super interesting to me. So this kind of gets into our next question then, and you've already, I think, started to address why having a Solicitor General, what that is and why that's important. What is the difference between, other than the fact that he's your boss and she could be your boss if it was a her? What is the difference between the Attorney General and the Solicitor General? Like, why do you need both?
Yeah. So I work for the Attorney General,
right?
And in a certain sense, I am one among several division chiefs. So the Attorney General's office has numerous divisions that do very many different things. So we have a Consumer Protection Division. We have a division that deals with public utilities and making sure the ratepayers are protected. We have a division that deals with trial level litigation. We have a division that deals with legal counsel, i.e. advising state agencies who essentially hire the Attorney General's office as their legal counsel, especially the smaller state agencies that don't have their own general counsel. We have a criminal appeals division that deals with all of the appeals from criminal convictions around the state. My office deals mainly with civil appeals, somewhat with criminal appeals, but also focuses on some of the most important appeals that we have in the state in front of the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the Attorney General needs lots of help in being the chief legal officer of the state, and I'm grateful that Attorney General Mike Hunter has entrusted me with the responsibility in some of the state's most interesting cases.
Interesting. That's super cool. You know, you mentioned that it's important to have, or it can really be beneficial to have, you know, someone like yourself who kind of specializes in this appellate process that's different than trial process. But there are some, you know, there are occasions when, you know, the Attorney General has said, okay, we are in this instance going to use an outside law firm to handle this issue or that issue. Is there I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this question, and I'll ask it in whatever way I can, but I think you know what I'm getting at, so you answer it however you think is the best way. When would you decide to hire outside counsel for a case versus having the Solicitor General's office handle the case?
Yeah. I think it's often a question of capacity and almost a cost benefit analysis. So, you know, the Attorney General's office right now is involved in a major lawsuit against opioid manufacturers, and our office doesn't necessarily have the capacity to engage in a massive, complex litigation. Especially because although we have many lawyers in our office, they are busy doing the state's work that they're normally doing on a day in and day out basis. So to add on top of that a massive piece of litigation that is very, very important to the state is not necessarily the wise things to do, and it might be a penny wise, pound foolish. And then on top of that, you know, there is a significant dollar amount at stake in some of these cases.
Sure.
And so it sometimes makes sense for the state to hire outside counsel, again, to make sure that they win the case. Another example of where we'd hired outside counsel is a case that we now have in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that I'll talk about a little bit later, where I advise the Attorney General that the case is so very important that we need the absolute best legal representation. And we went out and hired a lady named Lisa Blatt, who has argued, I think, 35 cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and won 33 of them, giving her
that seems like a good record.
Potentially the best record of anybody alive right now.
She's the Michael Jordan of solicitors.
Yeah.
Of private Supreme Court
Supreme
lawyers.
Court
Yeah,
advocates.
yeah. Right, yeah.
So these are situations where, you know, in our judgment, the state is best served by hiring outside counsel. And that's not, if you think of the state and as any other corporate entity like a big company. Big companies like Walmart or Boeing have their general counsels,
Right.
but they often hire outside lawyers to litigate their big cases because that is the wise thing to do. And if the attorney general is the general counsel for the state of Oklahoma, sometimes it makes sense to, even if you have a large legal team, hire outside counsel to do work that could be done a lot better by people who specialize in the area or
Sure.
who have a greater capacity to do these things.
Sure. So, you've mentioned a couple. This is something that's just interesting to me. So, you've mentioned a couple times that like you are the chief litigator for the state, right?
On appeals and constitutional issues.
Yeah. On appeals, yeah, and
I
thank
have
you
lots
for
of wonderful litigating colleagues.
Yes, thank you for making me be more specific. On appeals and constitutional issues, and so you would theoretically, right, be the chief advocate for the state of Oklahoma in cases that appear both before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of Oklahoma.
That's correct.
You also mentioned earlier, like, you're not going to say like that the Supreme Court of Oklahoma is like less than the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which I think is probably wise given what you do and just the fact that they're two different legal systems. So that seems like that requires you to have a lot of insight into both state law and federal law at the like appellate level. And I'm curious, do those ever interplay? Like, could you see a case that goes before the Supreme Court of Oklahoma, and maybe one of the parties doesn't like the outcome, and then it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court? Like, is that a thing that can happen, or are they parallel systems all the way up that don't ever cross? And how do you maintain expertise in both of those things? Because that seems like it would be a lot.
That's yes, that is very possible. One of the things I like about being an appellate lawyer is that it's a specialty without a specialty. So every case is a new thing for me, and there are skills that appellate lawyers have that are translatable between the two court systems. You do have to sort of deal with the quirks of any given court system as you're moving between them. But being an appellate lawyer at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, where Oklahoma is in, and being at the Oklahoma Supreme Court is not too different. And every case is new. So my first ever case at the Attorney General's office was the U.S. Supreme Court case, Glossop v. Gross, where we were defending the state's lethal injection protocol, and I had to learn everything I could learn about benzodiazepines, which is a little bit maybe more in your wheelhouse, but the amount of studies I read on midazolam and other benzodiazepines would probably be,
A lot.
pretty significant, even for a medical professional. And I've had to deal with many other cases that go from learning about auditing to learning about groundwater modeling. It varies quite a bit, and that's part of what I enjoy about the profession. You also asked about whether cases at the Oklahoma Supreme Court, or for that matter the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, gets appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they absolutely can. So first thing to know, because I mentioned it, is there are actually two highest courts in Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the highest court for criminal matters, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court, which is the highest court for civil matters. It's a little unusual. Only one other state has that system, and that's Texas, right below us.
I like that you said Texas is below us.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Those cases can get appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court on federal issues. So state courts are competent to hear issues of both federal law and state law. But the state Supreme Court, or the Court of Criminal Appeals, is the highest authority on state law, and the U.S. Supreme Court will never question or overturn them on a question of state law. But the federal courts can sometimes hear state law issues, but only if it's somehow connected to a federal law issue they're already hearing.
Interesting.
And so the federal courts generally are courts only hearing federal issues or issues where there are parties that are litigating against each other from two different states, called diversity cases. And so, yes, we have litigated cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that have come from our Court of Criminal Appeals or from our state Supreme Court. None of them that made it to the merit stage, at least in my experience, at the U.S. Supreme Court, but some to the certiorari stage. So the Supreme Court
You
can
just spoke
decide.
Latin. What does that mean?
The Supreme Court can decide which cases to hear and which to not hear, and the way that you ask for them to decide is you petition for a writ of certiorari. I'm not going to go into the Latin of what that means exactly.
That's fine.
But the U.S. Supreme Court hears maybe 60, 70, 80 cases a year, but gets thousands of petitions for writs of certiorari every year. And we deal with many of them at the Attorney General's office. So, for example, many of them from our Court of Criminal Appeals. This past year, I think I dealt with 3 on the same issue from the Court of Criminal Appeals involving blood draws in fatality accidents to test for people's alcohol level and whether it complies with the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is a federal issue, which is why it could be appealed from a state court
Fourth
to the
Amendment
U.S.
is
Supreme Court.
unreasonable search and seizure.
Among other things, yes.
Right. And interesting. So
Like you just like, I'm gonna show off right now.
I just making sure that I was right and
I
that
know.
the listeners know why.
What the? I'm not shaming you.
No. Well,
I forgot what the Fourth Amendment was for a few minutes there. I like that. Also, Mithen said among other things. 'Cause that
I don't
was-
claim to know all of them.
Right. Mithen, so can I ask why should regular people care about the Solicitor General? Like, how does it impact everyday, Joe the plumber? How does it impact our lives, and why should we care?
I'm not sure you should care about me or look up to me in any particular sense. The Attorney General's office, as a whole, does a lot of work on behalf of the people, and we as the Solicitor General's office do that as well, especially when we're defending the constitutionality of laws. The best way I can express it is we are the state's defender of our democratic processes. So whether it's an act of the legislature, an act of the people, or an act of the people's representatives in the form of executive officials, we at the Attorney General's office, and specifically within the Solicitor General's office of the Attorney General's office, defend those democratic decisions. I did take the liberty of listening to your first ever podcast on this podcast.
Ooh, our very first
and
one.
it was covering a case that I argued.
Really?
Yes, it was over the cigarette fee, auto sales tax,
yes.
and other tax cases. So that was your first podcast and my first argument at the Oklahoma Supreme Court. I had been Solicitor General for 4 or 5 months at that point.
Right.
And obviously this is something that the entire state was paying attention to. It was the first ever time the Oklahoma Supreme Court had televised oral arguments.
Right.
And me as a Solicitor General was up there arguing those cases on behalf of the state.
So that's a great question. So when you say on behalf of the state, I'm trying to think. So who is the state that you represent there? Is it the legislature? Is it the people? Because people might have different perspectives on the legality of one of those things, right?
Sometimes it depends on who the other party chooses to sue as far as specifically. But I represent the state in almost all of its forms, whether it is the state as represented by the people. So, for example, when the people voted to amend the Constitution to change how, in 2016, to change how alcohol is regulated in the state.
Right.
The Retail Liquor Association and liquor stores sued over it, claiming that constitutional amendment violated the federal Constitution.
Right.
And I, as Solicitor General, came in and defended that law in state and federal district court. And we prevailed. And so come October, there will be a new way alcohol is regulated in the state.
Thank you.
You're welcome. No other case has made me more popular among my friends than that case.
So, but in the case of the cigarette tax, this is when Gary Richardson was among those who sued, saying that the laws as passed were unconstitutional. Right. And so your role was to defend the laws as passed, saying they are constitutional, and here's why.
Right. So the tobacco companies sued, the auto dealerships
right,
sued.
That's right. There was several suits.
Yes.
It was an exciting few weeks.
It was, and it was I feel like my debut in this, my public debut in the
Right,
state.
right.
As people seeing and watching the live stream, saying,
Well, that's funny.
who's
I
that
remember watching
dorky
it.
guy in
yeah.
glasses arguing.
My staff would come into my office and be like, "What are you listening to?" Like usually it's music, and I was like, "Supreme Court case." And they're like, "You're such a nerd."
So
it's good to
in
meet
that
you in
case,
person.
I was, it's dependent on the suit, but oftentimes who you represent is the party that would be enforcing the law. So in some cases, for example, it was the Oklahoma Tax Commission,
Right.
who I was technically representing. But in any event, it's always in my capacity as defending the laws of the state.
Interesting.
So, all right, that's really cool about like why people should care about what your office does. What is the two things, I guess? What are you doing right now? Are there any like either, obviously you deal right like almost exclusively with pending litigation. So, is there anything that you can talk about like in general terms about interesting and important cases that you have coming up? And in the future, how do people know what you guys are doing and keep up with it and know what's going on with the Solicitor General's office?
So one of the fun parts about my job is that many, if not most, of my cases somehow end up in the newspaper. There's no set way to follow me or my office. You can subscribe to the Attorney General's office's press releases, I'm sure, and that'll give you at least some idea of what I do, but more broadly what the Attorney General's office does.
Sorry, guys, just
but
on my phone.
oftentimes seeing the newspaper. So, for example, the newspaper this morning, the morning we're recording this podcast, there were 4 or 5 news stories about the hearing on the health department's medical marijuana rules, which the new revised rules I was defending in court, and prevailed in convincing the court not to enjoin the rules. In other words, stop them from going forward as the litigation progresses. So the plaintiffs in that case challenged 21 rules, and the judge agreed with us that all 21 of them can go forward as the litigation goes forward. And that was covered by 4 or 5 news organizations this morning. So that's one case that I'm litigating right now. It's unusual for me in the sense that it is not an appeal, nor is it a constitutional issue. But at the same time, because it was a important case that obviously was of wide public interest, the Attorney General saw it fitting that I defend the case. Another case that is ongoing right now that your listeners might want to know about is currently at the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not common. It's not every year we have a case accepted for review by the U.S. Supreme Court.
When you say for review, this means the court's going to hear the case.
The court's going to hear the case,
which is a big deal.
which is a big deal. It's
Thousands
sort of-
and thousands of people, they hear like 70 or 80 a year, right?
Right, exactly.
SCOTUS blog.
Yes.
God, I love
So
SCOTUS blog.
And OYE also has the recordings of all the arguments. And that case is about essentially whether the entire eastern half of the state is an Indian reservation, which when I first moved to the state, I'm sure you've heard this before, people very quickly informed me that Oklahoma has no Indian reservations. And this case may upset that understanding to the tune of 48% of the state's population. So the case is actually a capital murder case where a man committed a brutal murder in eastern Oklahoma near Henrietta. And about 5 years after he was convicted and given the death penalty, he began arguing that the state did not have jurisdiction to try him because he was a enrolled member of the Creek tribe. His victim was also happened to be an enrolled member of the Creek tribe, and he committed the crime on the Creek reservation. And generally on Indian reservations, when a crime is committed by or against a Native American, the state does not have jurisdiction to prosecute the crime, but instead the federal government or sometimes the tribe does. That argument did not prevail in the state courts or in the federal district court, but the Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit last year ruled that indeed the Creek Nation does have an existing reservation that covers most of the city of Tulsa and 11 other counties. So we asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review that case. This is a case where we've hired Lisa Blatt, and they accepted review, and the case will be heard sometime this fall. We are currently in the middle of briefing. But essentially, the question in the case is a question of law, but also a really interesting question of history, which is when Congress did all that it did to prepare the state of Oklahoma for statehood and then make it a state, did it intend for the former Indian Territory, because if you remember your Oklahoma history, Oklahoma was a combination of the Oklahoma Territory and the Indian Territory. Did it intend the former Indian Territory, which is comprised primarily of the 5 civilized tribes, to all be an Indian reservation, or did it intend it to not be an Indian reservation? So that's the central question in this case. It's technically a murder case, but
That's not really the issue.
But the real issue is a question of Indian law and what did Congress intend in its actions that spanned between the 1890s and 1907 when Oklahoma became a state.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
And it's fascinating, but it's also really important, right?
Yeah.
Because the state has convicted thousands of people in eastern Oklahoma, many of whom may claim that they or their victims were Native Americans, which is, according to the census, self-identified about 12% of the population in this area. But then also, if you've ever been or spent time on an Indian reservation, there's lots of other things that are different about Indian reservations than land that is otherwise just completely regulated by the state, whether it relates to taxation or natural resource regulation like water or oil and gas, or environmental regulation, or zoning, or for that matter, even sort of child custody proceedings and things like that. A lot can change if this entire eastern half of the state is an Indian reservation.
That's interesting.
Well, and so again, I'll mention the book. Boomtown does kind of reference some of the early parts and how things were formed and not formed and whatever. There's another book that I've been reading off and on for a couple of years called Empire of the Summer Moon, which deals with the Comanche tribe, and it's absolutely fascinating. It deals with the last chief of the Comanches and how because it takes place here in Oklahoma and North Texas, and so I think it's really interesting to read about historical literature that's true that like happens here, and you can kind of place the Canadian River and where it bends and where the trains crossed, and that's Oklahoma City, and they talk about that stuff. Go ahead.
And Empire of the Sun Moon's a wonderful book. I'll also add to that Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yes,
which sounds like just the same variation on a theme,
right.
But it's about the Osage tribe in Oklahoma and the beginnings of the FBI. New York Times bestseller, I think, from 2016.
Yeah.
Also a very excellent book.
Yeah, that's next on my list. I think that stuff is fascinating. And Oklahoma has such a rich history with that, and it's a big deal. Also, this may have other implications because in 2020 is when the state has to renegotiate tribal compacts. Is it 2020? It's coming up soon because they didn't want to address ball and dice because the legislature wanted to keep that in their pocket to use that in negotiations for the tribal compacts.
Is it 2022?
It's sometime soon.
Yeah.
And on a personal note, I think it's wacky and maybe not cool that they're like, well, we want to hold on to this because we're getting a really unfair deal on this with the tribes. And I want to be like, do you? There's nothing you can say that's going to be fair for the tribes from their point of view, because we totally hosed them for several hundred years.
Yeah.
Still today, really. But this could be a huge. I mean, this has. I think, depending on how this goes, will have major implications for the way that not just Oklahoma but the United States relates to Native Americans.
100%.
Interesting.
Well, Mithin, we've had many guests on the show. A lot of people that are interesting to talk to. You've been very interesting to talk to. I think that I'm going to go ahead and throw out there. Of everyone we've had on the show so far, you have the most interesting and cool job. You have a cool job.
That's impressive. You've had state senators on here before.
And they're great, but you have a really cool job.
But there's like 49 of them.
Yeah. So we really appreciate your time, appreciate all your insight, appreciate you talking to people about what it is you do. And again, I think this is just another another great example of, hey y'all, here's this dude. Many of you didn't even know he exists, but his job and what he does has a huge impact on how you get to live your life every day. Local government matters, man.
That's true. Maybe there's some child listening in their parents' car, and they too want to grow up and become a solicitor general.
Oh, I hope that happens.
I do too.
If we get an email, we're going to forward it to you.
In 25 years.
That's right.
So it'd be great.
That's right.
All right, man.
All right.
Wrap it up.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Where's my button? There we go. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We're also on Spotify, Stitcher, Google, all those places. That helps other people discover us. You can also just tell your friends about us. That would be great. We really hope that we can help you and your friends become better informed and better educated and engaged Oklahomans. You can connect with us on Twitter and Instagram at Let's Fix This OK. Scott is at SC Melson. Andy is at AndyOKC. You can like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Let's Fix This OK. Check out our events tab on there. We've got a bunch of stuff coming up this year. Also over on our website, letsfixthisok.org. We've got an events page there. We've got our store that I mentioned earlier, a bunch of other jazz. Going to be adding some really great resources in the next couple of months. So be sure to check it out. Also make a donation while you're there. That would be really excellent as well and help us keep doing this and doing what we're doing. Our theme music is provided by the Sugar Free All-Stars. Our podcast is edited and produced by Scott and me. And we are a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network. Check them out. Wafty Show coming back online here next month. Let's Fix This is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization who strives to educate and equip all Oklahomans to engage with the government. We encourage you to get involved in any way you can. And remember, decisions are made by those who show up. Have a great week.